Health Secretary 18 months ago, you said the policy of this department is that the NHS is broken. What state would you say it's in now?
The patient is on the road to recovery, but not out of the woods yet. We're 18 months into this government, and we can confidently say 18 months in that waiting lists are lower than when we came to office, 300,000 lower today than when Labour came in. For the latest figures, which were for November, we saw the single biggest fall in waiting lists in a single month for 15 years. We've got patient satisfaction with access to general practice up from 60% when we came in to 75% today. And in December, despite the busiest month on record for 999 calls and the challenges of winter and the challenges of strikes, ambulances arrived about 15 minutes faster this December than they did the previous December. So there are lots of grounds for optimism, lots of green shoots for recovery, but we're not out of the woods. Because while waiting lists are lower, there are still far too many people on them, and they are waiting too long. While 3 in 4 people are satisfied with access to general practice, a quarter are not, and that is not good enough as far as I'm concerned. And while ambulance response times are improving, they are still not yet meeting the standard that the NHS sets for itself, and that I would expect for me, for my family, for all of you, and for our country. So we've got to tell that story confidently, especially in the run-up to May, of an NHS that is improving and on the road to recovery, but we've also got to show the public that we're not complacent, that there are still trolleys on hospital corridors, and we're going to deal with those problems. I think the final thing I would say about the NHS, and it speaks to a broader point about politics, the government, and how we make our case. The choice at the next general election will not simply be a technocratic one about who can get the plumbing working most effectively, about who can cut waiting lists more quickly. It's also going to be a values-driven argument for the NHS. In the Conservative Party, to the extent they are still relevant, Kemi Badenoch says she wants a debate about the NHS's funding model. In Reform, Nigel Farage is clear he wants an insurance-style system. In fact, Farage wants to offer tax breaks and tax subsidies for people who pay for private healthcare as part of the first step to undermining the NHS, taking £1.7 billion out in tax cuts for the few at the expense of the NHS for the many. So don't be under any illusions about this. Politics is a battle for ideas. Change begins with an argument, and our argument between now and the next general election isn't just shorter waiting times and higher patient satisfaction with Labour. It's also between an NHS that is there for all of us, owned by all of us, so that whenever you fall ill, you never have to worry about the bill. That's the choice with Labour, the NHS and its values defended. The contrast is Reform that would dismantle the NHS, reduce it to a poor service for poor people, while the wealthy get to pay for their healthcare with better and faster care and tax cuts for the few. That's the dividing line, and we should make the values-driven argument confidently between now and May, and now and the next general election. Only Labour can be trusted with the NHS.
What's the most important lesson you've learned since you became Health Secretary?
That's a really great question. It's the most important lesson. Being the Health and Social Care Secretary is a bit like being the department's gladiator. And every day I have to go into work and fight something or someone. Sometimes they're internal battles, sometimes they're external battles, but everything that we are achieving in the NHS has been done through a fight and through an argument. You know, when we started out in opposition, I was saying that investment in the NHS itself isn't enough. The NHS also needs modernisation, and if we just try and fund a 20th century system with ever-increasing amounts of taxpayers' money, we would see a lot more money go to waste rather than a modern, efficient, effective health service. And we've seen in 18 months the difference that modernisation is making, whether it's groundbreaking technology that's improving diagnostics or treatment, or whether it's our approach of sending teams of top clinicians with experience of cutting NHS waiting lists by changing the methods of working into the areas with the highest waiting lists and the highest number of people off sick. Where we did that, without any extra funding, we actually cut waiting lists 3 times faster in those areas than the national average. But that was resisted, that argument about modernisation. It's like, no, it's just about money, not modernisation. This all sounds a bit too kind of back to the future New Labour. But I think we've shown that investment and modernisation matters. We've also encountered resistance when it comes to things like abolishing NHS England and halving the size of integrated care boards. Now, change is disruptive, and it does come with opposition, but doing that will free up £1 billion a year that we can invest into frontline services. And on public health and prevention, in the short time that I've been in office as Health and Social Care Secretary, we've been doing big things, from the tobacco and vapes bill going through Parliament that will create the first ever smoke-free generation and abolish smoking in our country, to the targeted ban on junk food advertising aimed at kids, the supervised toothbrushing in schools to stop kids ending up with rotting teeth going into hospital and having their teeth pulled out. Every single one of those things has been opposed. Every single one of them has been attacked as being nanny status. And that's why we always have to remember that change is always resisted, change is always an argument, and change is always a battle. And you have to go in prepared to face down that opposition, plough on. Have the humility to recognise that we don't all get things right, and there'll be some things where we have to rethink, reflect, adjust, recalibrate. But if anyone thought that government was going to be easy, you can just look back at every single game-changing Labour government this country has ever had. You know, what is now proved was once only imagined, as William Blake said, and so you have to make sure that you go in with courage and conviction and prepared to take on arguments, building coalitions where you can, but also confronting vested interests, of which there are many in every part of public policy.
I'm sure you know the old Nigel Lawson line about the NHS being the closest thing the English people have to a religion. But do you think there's a genuine danger that if you don't turn around the NHS in this Parliament, that voters will listen to politicians on the right say that the NHS model is bust and that you need to break with it, and they'll go, you know what, we think you're right?
Yeah, I can't tell you how much pressure I feel on my shoulders on any given day. At the moment, we're in the month of January. This is always the hardest month for the NHS. We actually did quite well in December, given the scale of the challenge we were up against. I mentioned those ambulance response times. We will see sort of year-on-year improvement. But we've had enormous surge in demand in January. And so I feel this everyday pressure that an ambulance that doesn't turn up in time has consequences. Someone waiting on a trolley on a hospital corridor does so with indignity. Someone who can't get through to their GP might give up and not come back until it's too late. So that's the everyday pressure I feel of trying to turn around a national health service that isn't always there for all of us where we need it and when we need it. But then there's that bigger political challenge of knowing that if a Labour government can't turn around the NHS, there is a real danger that the right will seize on that and try and dismantle it altogether. That is Nigel Farage's agenda. He wants the NHS to fail. He doesn't believe in it. He never has. And what's remarkable is that whenever we confront Nigel Farage about where he stands on insurance and an insurance-style system, he crumbles and buckles under pressure. and becomes like one of those typical politicians that he says he doesn't like and isn't like, but he crumbles under scrutiny. He knows it's not popular with the public. He desperately wants it to be because he doesn't believe in the NHS, and that's why we're going on the attack on his policy of subsidising private healthcare with tax incentives and tax breaks, because we know that is the first step on that slippery slope to people giving up on the NHS. And it's not just the service that matters, it's the values that underpin it. And you only have to look across the Atlantic to the United States of America to see a very different healthcare system, and frankly a healthcare system that Farage wants, where they check your pockets before your pulse, and they ask about your insurance details before your symptoms. Well, over my dead body, the NHS must always be there for us as a publicly funded public service free at the point of use.
Now, you are, of course, Secretary of State for Social Care as well as Health. I'm sure there are people in the audience who know the crisis that sector faces. What do you say to Fabian members, voters, who look at another commission reporting in 2028 and say, look, this doesn't meet the urgency of the moment, we need a solution quicker?
So I understand that concern or even cynicism, given the checkered history of social care. I'd just say two things in response. The first is, since we've come into government, we've actually done a lot on social care in a relatively short space of time. And not just the extra £4.5 billion we've put into social care, but the expansion of the Disabled Facilities Grant, which means thousands more home adaptations every year to make sure people can live with dignity and independence and good quality of life. The biggest expansion of carers allowance since the 1970s to support unpaid family carers. And we've legislated for the first ever fair pay agreements in our country, backed by £500 million as the first step to building a real social care profession in our country that regards care workers as care professionals for the highly skilled professional work they do. That's what we've done in just 18 months. But the reason I asked Louise Casey to do a commission on social care is threefold. First is, she is one of Whitehall's best-known doers, and that is why whenever there is a big challenge to solve, we normally see speculation in the media that Louise Casey is going to be asked to do it or solve it. Secondly, we've got to build a national consensus around social care, what it is and how it should be funded. Because for too many people in our country, they don't even know what social care is until it is too late. And then they are confronted with a system that is too often poor quality and also results in catastrophic care costs for families. And so building that national consensus around those things will up the ante politically, so that now and in the future, political parties can't get away with relegating social care as a second-order issue, which brings me to my third point. We have got to do in this century what Attlee and Bevan did in the last, which is to build a national care service worthy of the name that socialises the risks and makes sure there is high-quality care based on need and not the ability to pay. That is a big challenge, and there are lots of different funding models that you could choose in order to pursue that goal, which is why I hope we can build that kind of national consensus. We've got an ageing society, and thanks to breakthroughs in medical technology, we've now got disabled people not just surviving but thriving, and with a far longer life expectancy than would have ever been possible when the NHS was founded. But whether it's care for older people so they can not just look back on a life well lived, but live life till the full, until the very end, or whether it's a care system that meets the need of disabled people of all ages so that they can achieve their potential, be part of society, make a contribution and live a happy life, you can only do that with good quality social care from the cradle to the grave. We are far from that now. But we've got to build, through the battle of ideas, the national consensus we need, and I really believe this commission will help us to do that.
Now, you alluded to the May elections earlier. That's the biggest set of contests in this parliament. I had a look at the latest poll of polls earlier today. Labour's currently on 18%, level pegging with the Tories 8 points behind Reform. This is more than just normal midterm blues. So what do you think is going wrong, and how can you turn it around?
I think in some ways the tragedy is that in the last 18 months, this government has done a lot of good and delivered on so many of our promises. But if you assemble the cabinet on this platform and asked us to write down a list of the things that we've done, our top 3, there'd be a bit of an overlap, but we probably all choose slightly different things and different emphases. And then that will be true for Labour MPs, and I suspect it will be true for Labour Party members in this room too. We've got to make sure that the change that we're bringing to this country is wrapped up in a compelling story about what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, who we're for, what we're for, and to do that in a values-driven way so that people can connect with how this country will be better as a result of the fairer choices that a Labour government is making. So that's where we've got to do better, and May's elections give us an opportunity to do that. But in doing so, we also need to confront what has been a sense of cynicism and pessimism in our country about whether things can get better, that's increasingly sliding into a state of fatalism, that things can't get better. And that is a dangerous place for a country to be, particularly in the volatile and insecure world that we live in, where our opponents want to try and weaponise that kind of pessimism and fatalism, so that even our own country believes that its best days are behind, and to invert the mood music I grew up to, that things can only get worse. And we have to win that battle, because the next election isn't just the classic left-right fight. It's a battle between progressives and reactionaries, and it's a battle of hope versus hate. And we know what the consequences for our country are if we let that kind of politics win. And it's not just the classic Tory threat of running down our public services and making decisions in the interests of a privileged few. It's the kind of country where people fly our flag to say that it belongs to people who look like me, and not for people who look like the Mayor of London, who was here today giving an extremely powerful speech. And so we've seen these forces at work before, and I just sort of say to people across the Labour movement that this is our fight. It has always been our fight. We have always stood against racism, discrimination and injustice. We have always stood against unfairness and created progressive policies and public services that correct injustice in our country. People chose change at the last general election, and now we have to deliver it, because people rolled the dice wanting something better in 2016 when they voted to leave the European Union. They rolled the dice again with Boris Johnson when they felt that wasn't happening. And to be honest, many people rolled the dice at the last general election in the hope that Labour would do better than our predecessors. And if we fail to deliver and fail to give people that sense of optimism and hope for the future that progressive politics relied on, they will roll the dice again, and we will end up with something very different and very dangerous. So there is a lot resting on our shoulders, and it relies on us making values-driven arguments, delivering the change that people voted for, and tackling the deep injustices in this country that leaves people feeling poorer, that leaves children worse off than their parents, and leaving people feeling that the good things that are happening in the country and the world are passing them or their towns or their communities by. Where people feel that when they work hard and play by the rules, that their effort isn't matched with reward, or they're playing by the rules but someone else isn't, and that tends to be people who are wealthier and more powerful too. So this is a progressive moment. This is a moment for progressives to rise to. This is the challenge that we're confronting. Of course it's hard. Look at the scale of the challenges domestically and internationally. Look at the challenges in terms of politics and trust in politics, the economy and our public services, and look at the challenges of security and insecurity at home and around the world. It is hard, and that is precisely why in government we must not waste a single minute in delivering the change and the hope that people voted for.
It was sometimes said of Labour's left-leaning voters that they don't have anywhere else to go. Well, at the moment, a lot of them are going to the Greens, who are now on 16%. How do you win back the progressive voters you've lost to that party and counter the Green threat more broadly?
So look, I do think we should take the challenge to both our left and to our right seriously. And one of the great things about my constituency on the London-Essex border is I've got them all. I've had to fight opponents to my left, as I did at the last election. I've had to fight opponents to my right, where we've got reform putting us under pressure in my constituency. In fact, I saw some polling just the other week that showed Labour down to 86 seats, with Ilford North being one of them. I saw another poll that showed Ilford North being reform, and I saw another poll showing Ilford North going independent. So I absolutely get the pressure that Labour is facing to our left and to our right. So what do we do about it? I think there's a few things. One is you can't just focus on one flank or another. So we have to unite progressives, and we have to reach into the centre and the centre-right, where there are lots of homeless, sensible people who are looking at Badenoch and Farage and thinking, I wouldn't normally vote Labour, but actually, if it's the choice between them or Farage, well, I know where the country would be better off. And so you've got to make sure you win over that centre ground. But we also can't be complacent about our progressive flank either. And the good news is that we have the ideological tools available to us to unite the left if we choose to use them. One of the things the Fabian Society understands is the intellectual traditions of our party and the way in which every successful Labour government has been elected on and delivered on the unity of socialists, social democrats and liberals. You look right back into Labour's history to our ethical Christian socialist roots of Tawney, to the hard-headed realism of Durbin, to the hard-headed pragmatism of Crossland that understood that you've got to make markets work for people rather than the other way round. And then you look at our liberal inheritance too, and the way in which we drew on great liberal thinking, from Beveridge to Keynes. And that is how we have built some of our country's greatest institutions and high-performing public services. How we've not just won elections, but tackled injustice. And that's why the values-driven argument really is so important. Because if the argument is simply a technocratic one that says, look, we're the people who are going to roll up our sleeves and fix things like Britain's maintenance department, well, there's certainly nothing wrong with that because people want things fixed and there's plenty to fix in our country. But if they don't understand the values, the motivations, and crucially the choices between what you offer and what someone else offers, then someone can come along, I don't know, maybe with a turquoise hoodie on from Reform UK and say, yeah, we're in the maintenance business too. And yeah, we can fix some of the things that you're angry about. And in fact, you know, we're going to blame a few people while we're at it and try and turn you against your neighbour. And people have to understand, because politics is a battle of ideas and because choices have consequences, they've got to understand why they will be better off with Labour in terms of our policies, in terms of our impact, what we've delivered, sure, but also the values that are up for grabs. And there is such enormous ground for us to fight on. The majority of people in this country do not want to see the end of the NHS and do not want it replaced with an insurance system. There is our values-driven argument with Farage on the NHS right there. People in this country are absolutely clear where they stand in the war in Ukraine and the battle for freedom and democracy that the Ukrainians are fighting for. And we have seen the dissembling, mealy-mouthed, pro-Putin talking lines emanating from Farage. And if we have any doubt about the extent to which they're in it up to their necks on Russian money, just look at their former leader in Wales. There is a rich dividing line for Labour versus Reform. And then we saw the way in which they've tried to pit people against each other based on who they are, what they look like, where they're from, or who they worship. And I felt that really acutely after the summer in my own constituency, one of the most diverse in the country, when people in my constituency felt genuinely afraid because of the undercurrent that had emerged in our country. And so we've got to make sure that we take that fight head on. When Farage told health and social care workers that they would be deported if they didn't earn enough and would tell them to go home, I stood up as this country's health secretary and said, with Labour, you are home, and this will always be your home. That is the difference between Labour and Reform. And I'll tell you something else as well, because this, he says something profane, and then I remembered how many cameras are here. Here's something that really boils my blood, rather than the other thing I was thinking of. This really boils my blood. I really hate, as someone who grew up in London's East End, in a working class family, to put it mildly, I really hate the way someone like Farage has the audacity to say to people from backgrounds like mine who look like me that he is more in touch with their needs and concerns than this Labour government. Moreover, I hate the way he tries to tell people from backgrounds like mine that the source of the problems in their country is as a result increase the public health grant, but we need to keep the pressure up because this is always contested territory. And there's always an extent to which people say, oh, I don't think you should go there. It's all... And that's the irony of the right's attacks on kind of so-called nanny statism, is that unless you invest in the health of the nation and unless you do prevention, you end up asking people to pay more out of their own pockets, either through taxes to fund a stressed health service or out of their own pockets to fund private healthcare if they're lucky enough to be able to do that. So prevention will remain a big part of my agenda. On to resident doctors. We're in a much happier place this side of Christmas in that we are around the table and talking. I've never closed the door to resident doctors in the way that my predecessors did. And look, candidly, we've done a lot on jobs, to your point, and there's an emergency legislation coming forward this week, but we are still far apart on pay in terms of what the BMA are asking for and what the country can afford. And all I'd say to resident doctors, I mean, having had a 28.9% pay rise from us so far, we've done a lot, but I also have a responsibility to 1.5 million staff who work in the NHS, many of whom will never earn as much as the lowest paid doctor. And they have had, over many years now, lower percentage pay increases from a lower base salary than doctors. So I'm trying to be fair about this, but we are trying to reach an agreement. And then there are the other choice and trade-off I've said to the BMA is we could throw more money at pay, but it might be at the expense of the investment we can put into the service. And a broken NHS with crumbling buildings and poor patient services would be one where we might have better paid doctors, but they'd still be really unhappy and suffering the moral injury many of them feel. So there's got to be a bit of give and take here, and that's what we're working to. Finally, to Kat's question. The SNP have been in power in Scotland for nearly 20 years now, and their record on the NHS has been utterly abysmal throughout their time in government. And it is no use trying to throw your weight around at 5 minutes to midnight on a failed government in the hope that people might forget your abysmal record. And it is no use now trying to pin all of your problems on Westminster. Because while I accept that so many of the challenges we see across the United Kingdom were exacerbated by over a decade of Conservative government, and as I said before the general election, all roads lead to Westminster. Well, since we came into government, down that road to Holyrood has been the biggest funding increase to Scotland and the Scottish Government in the history of devolution, thanks to a Labour government. And what's more, we could have a Scottish Labour government with Anas Sarwar and Jackie Baillie working with a UK Labour government to work together, sharing knowledge on how to cut waiting lists, sharing cooperation when it comes to complex procedures and our life sciences based, and also making sure that people in Scotland don't have to wait until 2030 for an NHS app. I mean, it's astonishing. I mean, I thought our NHS app was a bit clunky. At least we've got one. In Scotland, unless you live in one county and you've got a skin condition, you don't have an NHS app. That's how backwards the SNP are. That's how bad their record of failure is. And we owe it to Scotland's future to make sure that we get Anas Sarwar and Jackie Baillie and the Scottish Labour team into government to deliver the change that Scotland deserves.
Okay, I'll take another batch of three. Yes, the gentleman with the... I'm
going to call it a beige turtleneck, George. Yeah, hi, thanks, Wes. My partner's a midwife, so this question comes from her rather than from me. I'm sure you're aware that Leah Hazard's campaign is sort of picking up steam, sort of highlighting sort of the issues with pay and conditions for midwives across the country, and obviously the pressures that they face, particularly on a daily basis. So what steps is the government taking to improve the pay and conditions of midwives?
Okay, thank you, sir.
I'm worried about the person standing on the chair at the back, because I don't need anyone else in A&E.
Let's take them for points for effort. Let's...
Thank you. My name's Richard. I'm from Milton Keynes. Thank you for what you said about ensuring that people from around the world are able to access care through our NHS. I wonder if you had any reflections about what Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did to set the agenda for countries to collaborate to allow the poorest people from the poorest countries to access health care in their own health sectors.
Thank you. And one more. Yes.
So if you want a healthier population and fewer people walking through the doors of hospitals, could you put the provision of a network of walking and cycling routes through every town and city in Britain, and then we could all be outdoors and piles healthier? It would make a massive difference to the health of the whole population.
Thank you.
That is a great question, and speaks to sort of the mission-driven approach to government that I think is really important, because most of the people who hold levers for positive health in government do not work in my department. So good transport, walking, cycling, mass transit, cutting air pollution and improving our air quality, that makes a massive difference to our health, but that sits in DEFRA in the Department for Transport. When Bridget's doing her breakfast clubs, she's not just making sure the kids start the day with hungry minds instead of hungry bellies. She's also making sure they get nutritional food, and that's true for our school food standards too. And if they're playing at lunchtime and getting more time, not just for PE and physical activity, but for music and drama and performing arts, then she's making a really big contribution to young, healthy minds and bodies and souls, which is amazing. And that's true right across government. So we are thinking in exactly the way you describe about how we can make sure we have health in every policy right across government. And I think we campaigned on missions in opposition. I believe very strongly that mission-driven approach is still the right thing now to try and break down that siloed working that we see too often and I experience too often in Whitehall. On midwives' pay, I mean, that's actually related back to doctors in a way. I do have to be fair to everyone. And midwives, nurses and allied health professionals were all part of something we created in government called Agenda for Change, which was a single pay spine. And it's lagged behind doctors. And so I am prioritising at the moment in talks with unions investment in and modernisation of Agenda for Change to tackle some of that unfairness. And to Richard's point right at the back, that this is a real challenge because I feel that in recent years, so much of the progress that we were seeing when we were last in government and was even sustained when the coalition was in government has completely changed as the world has changed around us. You know, you can kid yourselves that pulling up the drawbridge and torching international institutions and undermining the World Health Organization or, you know, taking a battering ram to multilateral cooperation is the way to provide greater security. It really isn't. The world's no less interdependent now than it was when we were vowing to make poverty history, just because some strong men in populist governments have decided they don't like multilateralism and want a return to a different kind of world order. So if we're serious about tackling the challenges of migration, if we're serious about tackling climate change, if we're serious about tackling poverty and injustice and war and famine, that requires all of us to work together. And that's why, as well as here at home, on the international stage, we have to make those values-driven arguments. And we have to make sure that we are working with and through partners, the World Health Organization, the G7, G20, the Commonwealth, and other global fora and institutions to make sure that in this century the right values prevail. And, you know, let's be clear, we've been fighting a losing battle in recent years globally, so let's help get back on the front foot and make the case for the betterment of all humanity as our movement demands.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question, no pressure. We'll take the gentleman just there, the curly hair. Yes, you. Yeah.
Thank you. Two quick ones. One, I'd love some work experience, member of the Young Fabians. And two, on a bit more of a serious note, I was horrified at the comments coming out of Trump about our heroes in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'd really want to know your thoughts and those brave men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you.
If you don't ask, you don't get. Feel free to drop an email to my office and we'll see what we can do. Now there'll be a deluge. Look, to that wider point, only once in the history of NATO has Article 5 been invoked where NATO members respond to the aid of another. And that was when America invoked it in the aftermath of 9/11. And the UK, Denmark, and other NATO countries answered that call. Since the foundation of NATO, and in fact since we fought side by side in the Second World War to secure the liberation of this continent from Nazi tyranny, we have fought side by side with our American friends and with our NATO allies. We've spilled blood, we've lost lives, and that was as true in the war in Afghanistan as in every other conflict where we fought alongside the United States. And what was said this week was such a disgraceful disservice to brave servicemen and women who gave their lives, put themselves in harm's way, and did so because of the shared history and shared values that our countries share. And I was really proud of the way that Keir, as our Prime Minister, responded and spoke for them, for their memory, and for the many servicemen and women and their families who are still with us and were horrified by those remarks. In the world that we live in, with the sorts of challenges we face, and where it is not yet clear whether democracy or tyranny will prevail in the 21st century, democracies have to stand together. This is too an important a moment in the world's history for us to be divided. And we've got to stick together on the basis of shared values, shared ideals, and shared interests. And we know we can do it because we proved it in the last century. And the way in which we will see greater security and shared prosperity in this century is if we stick together again. And I hope that the chorus of condemnation that we've heard, not just in this country, but across the NATO alliance, will have been registered with our friends in the United States. And that in the coming days, weeks, months and years, we continue to stand together for democracy, for freedom, for human rights, and for justice at home and abroad. Thank you very much.
That feels like a very apt note on which to end. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Thank you for your questions. The next session is with Ed Miliband, so do stick around for that. But will you please show your appreciation for Wes Streeting?